I think the main question out of this that I have is like, how prevalent is the issue of trans athletes? Let's listen to Senator Dick Durbin here question the president of the NCAA, Charlie Baker, at a hearing last month.
How many athletes are there in the United States in NCAA schools?
510,000.
How many transgender athletes are you aware of?
Less than 10.
Less than 10
Yep.
out of 510,000?
Yep.
Okay, so a congressional bill for less than, potentially 10 people, 10 kids. So why is this getting congressional attention?
Well, first of all, one little nuance to that, obviously they're talking about college sports. Mm-hmm. Charlie Baker says less than 10 transgender athletes. That doesn't even denote how many are trans women versus trans men. Mm-hmm. So, and let's just be honest, this is I would say generally speaking, this is a trans woman situation. This is the whole protecting women and girls in sports. This is about trans women, not so much trans men. So you don't even know. It could be one. I mean, yeah, it could be 10. It could be one.
Yeah.
Like we don't even know the actual amount of trans women. And to answer your question, this is really just, this whole thing has really just been this effort to, for politicians mostly, but for people to scare people, for people to tap into the unknown, what people don't know, to try to get public support in order, and they're using this guise of protecting women and girls in sports. They're using that to do so. And the way I see it, it's like, I also want to protect women and girls in sports. I think both of us could sit here and talk about all the things we've seen in our time. Some of the really bad and really negative things we've seen.
Yeah. And experienced, yeah.
Yeah, and experience. And I'm just focused on the things that are actual threats. And that's what kind of brings me back to this 10 out of 510,000. And I understand the congressional bills for kids, and we're looking at elite athletes in a sense because they're college, but still. There's how many times have you, I don't know if this happens too, I've opened up social media and there's these polls where it shows like how many Muslims are in the US, how many trans, and people think it's like 20 to 25%. It literally goes down like a lot of the minorities, right? It's like, how many do you think of it? And when it gets to trans, people are like, 15, 20%. And it's like 0.0001. And that's the thing, like, what are we really talking about? So back to the whole idea of protecting women and girls in sports, like I said, I'm all for that. I just want to focus on the things that are actually the threat. And Charlie Baker in the same congressional hearing talks about just that.
I assume the NCAA is also concerned with other issues in women's sports.
The harassment that I speak of is far more prevalent in major women's championships than it is in men's championships. And in fact, the data that we put forward from our major championships last year showed that the worst examples of online threats, abuse, and harassment were being directed at women basketball players playing in our women's basketball tournament. That, in many respects, I think, is not as well known as it should be. We tried to do a pretty good job to promote it and make clear to people that that was, in fact, the championship that had the most brutal and the most troubling and the nastiest collection. And all we know of is what shows up on their public handle.
Yeah, what stuck out to me there, outside of the obvious, was not as well known as it should be. Because when you think about trans athletes, whether it's K through 12, college, Olympics, WNBA, NWSL, so on and so forth, the way that commercials were run during the campaigns, the way that it's talked about, when certain politicians are on podiums, you would think it's a larger issue. And yet, the NCAA partnered with a group called Signify to investigate online harassment. This is like summer, fall of 2024. And, it monitored, I'm just going to read this, it monitored public comments targeting the online profiles of student athletes, coaches, and officials in 7 NCAA championships, as well as the college football national championship. Some quick stats that they found: 18% of all abuse was sexual, 12% of all abuse was related to sports betting, and that actually increased for men's basketball and college football as like they got further in. 10% of abuse consisted of racist content. 9% of abuse was homophobic, transphobic. 6% of abuse was violent, approximately 380 instances, I believe, out of like 70 plus thousand or something like that. But the quote, far more prevalent that Charlie Baker is referring to is that 80% of the abuse in the study was directed at March Madness basketball student athletes, men and women. Women's basketball student athletes received approximately 3 times more threats than the men. And so for me, that's where I'm like, well, where's the protection on that? And that's where, I just feel you can sense that it's getting co-opted and used, hijacked even. And by the way, that doesn't even talk about Angel Reese's AI images. The fact that both Caitlin Clark and Paige Beckers just had stalkers arrested.
In real life.
In real life.
Arrested in real life.
In the last couple months.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you know better than anybody what's happened in the NWSL with the sexual abuse findings detailed in the Yates report. So that's what I think when I think of like the idea of what's really happening, right? When we say reroute, that's what I'm talking about. Like, what's really happening in the world? Like, what's really impacting women and girls in sports? And, when certain things are highlighted and you start to look into it and you're like, wait, that's not as prevalent as what's happening over here. That's just where the question marks start to arise for me. If you are interested in learning more about just the whole trans conversation, I actually think Pablo Torre has done a really good job. He's had 3 different podcasts, one about specific to trans players, one specific to policy, and then another specific to science. So I think there is a lot to be learned because when you do start to do the deep dives, you realize how much you don't know. And it is good to be educated if it's going to be, literally changing political climates. But at the end of the day, to me, it comes back to everything we just talked about with the abuse that we see online. Like, that's where we can really protect women in sports. So yeah, I feel like a lot of the problem is people think they know, but the truth is there's like so much to learn.
Yeah, and it's just being talked about in this way. And really just it's like fear-mongering. It's just like, all of the instances that we hear about, it's like 1 or 2 kids or 1 kid or, there's less than 10 athletes, as Charlie Baker was saying, out of 510,000. And it's being, propositioned to people, whether it's in, political campaigns or just general hate speech, that, they're taking over women's sports and we have to protect women from women's sports. I've always just thought that was very laughable to hear those types of people say that they want to protect women's sports and that they care about women's sports so much when they've literally never been here. And then when actual hate is not even hiding in plain sight, actual hate just is out in plain sight. And I loved what Charlie Baker said, actually. That's just what we are seeing on the public profiles and in the public spaces in the comments.
Not the DMs.
I can speak from experience. You can too. What is in the DMs is fucking crazy. It is the worst of the worst. Everything that you could possibly think of. It's awful.
Yeah.
And again, to have that show up in real life. Caitlin Clark just had a stalker arrested in Indianapolis. Paige Becker's stalker was in Connecticut, close to the school somewhere. So this stuff like shows up in real lives, and to have known that and to have, been able to see that in a public forum and nobody really do anything about it other than the security that's, detailing Caitlin and detailing Paige, for there to be such a lack of conversation. It's just like, it blows the whole argument up. It's like this conversation around trans athletes being able to participate and trans people being kids being able to participate in sport is not about the protection of girls at all. It's just fear-mongering in order to whip people up. And it's really sad. And again, in most of the cases, it's like a couple of kids that we're talking about. And it's like entire state governments, entire school boards, the president just like coming down on these kids who just want to participate in sports. It's really sad. Yeah, so that's kind of our reroute on this of talking about the things that women in sports and girls in sports actually need protection from. And these statistics about the abuse of social media is a really good one, but that's our reroute for the day. And we'll obviously continue to talk about this in the future as it seems to be a hot button issue for everybody.